Okay, so I will say this again. You may have noticed it looks a little different. You may be visiting for the first time. Lucky you that you are here today when we are sitting at our tables together. Every now and then we like to do an intergenerational service where we have our kids and our teenagers and our adults all together, and we like to learn from each other and learn together. So that's what we're doing today. Now, I asked you to grab a string. Everybody got a string? Yeah, so what we're going to do with this string, I'm going to start this now. We are going to add your string into the weaving. And what's going to happen is this is going to go around the tables throughout the whole service. There's 3 of them. When one comes to you, you tie it on. I'll show you like this. Ooh, yep. You tie it on just like this to the remaining string, and then you just keep going, follow the one in front, and hopefully by the end, we have something to show for all of this. Shenanigans. All right, so I'm going to get that started right over here. And right here and right here. And then we can move them on back. All right, so we're talking about storytelling today. And most of all, we're talking about the importance of your story. So I thought I'd start today by reading one of my favorite stories called Tiddler. Tiddler, the storytelling fish. All right? Okay. Anybody under the age of 10 know this story? Anyone? Oh, lucky day. You're going to enjoy this. My kids have begged me not to do voices, but I have no guarantees on that. So we'll see how this goes. All right. Here we go. Tiddler, the storytelling fish. Once there was a fish, and his name was Tiddler. He wasn't much to look at with his plain gray scales, but Tiddler was a fish with a big imagination. He blew small bubbles, but he told tall tales. Sorry I'm late. I was riding on a seahorse. Sorry I'm late. I was flying with a ray. Sorry I'm late. I was diving with a dolphin. Tiddler told a different story every day. At 9 o'clock on Monday, Miss Skate called the register. Little Johnny Dory, yes, Miss Skate. Rabbitfish, yes, Miss. Redfin, yes, Miss. Tiddler, Tiddler, Tiddler's late. Oh, sorry I'm late. I was swimming round a shipwreck. I swam into a treasure chest and someone closed the lid. I bashed and I thrashed till a mermaid let me out again. Oh, no, she didn't. Oh, yes, she did. It's only a story, said Rabbitfish and Redfin. Just a silly story, said Dragonfish and Dab. I like Tiddler's story, said little Johnny Dory, and he told it to his granny, who told it to a crab. At 9 o'clock on Tuesday, Miss Skate called the register. Little Johnny Dory, yes, Miss Skate. Spiderfish, yes, Miss. Sunfish, yes, Miss. Tiddler, Tiddler, Tiddler's late. Oh, sorry I'm late, miss. I set off really early, but on the way to school, I was captured by a squid. I wriggled and I struggled till a turtle came and rescued me. Oh, no, he didn't. Oh, yes, he did. It's only a story, said Spiderfish and Sunfish. Just a silly story, said Devilfish and Dace. I love Tiddler's story, said little Johnny Dory, and he told it to his granny, who told it to a place. Who told it to a starfish, who told it to a seal, who told it to a lobster, who told it to an eel. At 9 o'clock on Wednesday, Tiddler was dawdling, dreaming up a story, his tallest story yet. Lost inside his story, he didn't see the fishing boat. He didn't hear the fisherman. He didn't spot the net. Meanwhile, in the schoolroom, Miss Skate called the register. Little Johnny Dory, yes, Miss Skate. Leopardfish, yes, Miss. Leaffish, yes, Miss. Tiddler, Tiddler, Tiddler's late. Oh, we got it. 10 o'clock, 11 o'clock, still no Tiddler. 12 o'clock, lunchtime, where could he be? Far away the fishermen were hauling in their fishing net. This one's just a Tiddler. We'll throw it back to sea. I didn't do my Scottish accent, just so you know, for that one. Tiddler was lost in the middle of the ocean where strange lights glimmered and strange fish flew. He swam around in circles. He shivered in the seaweed, but then he heard a story a story that he knew. Tiddler rode a seahorse. Tiddler met a mermaid. Tiddler met a turtle who saved him from a squid. Tiddler found a shipwreck. Tiddler found a treasure chest. Oh, no, he didn't. Oh, yes, he did. Tiddler peeped out and he saw a shoal of anchovies. Excuse me, can you tell me where you heard that tale? Well, we heard it from a shrimp, but we don't know where she heard it. And they took him to the shrimp, who said, I heard it from a whale. I heard it from a herring. I heard it from an eel. I heard it from a lobster. I heard it from a seal. I heard it from a starfish. I heard it from a place. And the place said, just a minute, don't I recognize your face? I'm Tiddler, said Tiddler, and I'm tracking down my story. And the place replied, I heard it from my neighbor, Granny Dory. 1 o'clock, 2 o'clock, still no Tiddler, nearly home time, where could he be? And just as the fishes were finishing their lessons, in swam Tiddler at 3:30. I'm sorry I'm late, but I swam into a fishing net. I managed to escape, and I swam away and hid. I was lost, I was scared, but a story led me home again. Oh, no, it didn't. Oh, yes, it did. It's just another story, said leopardfish and leaffish. Just a silly story, said leopardfish or butterfish in blue. It isn't just a story, said little Johnny Dory. And he told it to a writer friend who wrote it down for you. That's Tiddler, my favorite story. It's actually really fun to read. But did you catch that at the end, that on that last page? I was lost, I was scared, but a story led me home again. Oh, no, it didn't. No, yes, it did. And that's what we're going to be talking about this morning, how our stories about our lives, about what has happened to us, what we have gone through, how we have lived, how we have been met with mercy, how we have been met with kindness. Those stories might be the stories that lead someone home, might be the story that leads you home again. So we spent last year talking about the big story of Scripture. For you kids, you did your own thing in Sunday school. The adults in here talked about the whole book of Scripture. We used this book, The Road We Made by Walking, who I actually got a chance to meet Brian McLaren yesterday, who wrote this book. Very cool. And I said, hey, we did this book all last year. And he said, you know, I said to my wife like 2 weeks ago that book, of all the books I've written, is the one book I'm glad I have written before I died. And I was like, oh, interesting, because he's written a lot of books, but this book, because it tells the whole story and gives us a way to put our stories into it, that's the one that he really loved. So I thought I would just share that with you, because that was a cool thing that happened yesterday. But this morning, we're going to be grandparents, parents, kids, teenagers. We're going to be all together, and we're going to think about our stories, about maybe where God has been in our lives, and we're going to talk about telling our stories together. And I want to, again, reiterate, you don't have to tell anyone anything you don't feel comfortable with. But we want to encourage the sharing. That's why we have the name tags. If you want to tell your table what your favorite story is, that's a great way to start to get to know someone. If you're like, oh, I love that book too, or wow, I don't understand why you like that book. Either way, you're starting to get to know someone. So that was just like a little exercise in thinking about your own life, what's going on, and then telling people your story. Hopefully it wasn't too intrusive, but just a little thing, get our juices flowing, because there's more coming. Just you wait. Okay, so stories are important. I'm going to do a couple of fun facts for you. I'm going to stand up here so everybody can see me. Did you know that humans, you, were actually created to tell stories? It is literally as natural to being a human as eating and sleeping. Here's a good quote. Storytelling has always been at the heart of being human because it serves some of our most basic needs, passing along our traditions, confessing failings, healing wounds, engendering hope, strengthening our sense of community. That's why we tell our stories. The last quote there says, we tell our stories because we hope to find or create significant connections between things. Stories link our past and our present and our future in a way that tells us where we've been, where we are, and where we could be going. Stories, our stories that we tell each other, tell us that there's a place for us and that we fit. Does Sounds good, hey? We were created to tell stories. Okay, fun fact number 2. Did you know that God is a storyteller? Did you know that Bible that you have on your shelf or by your bed or somewhere else in your bag or wherever you have your Bibles, handy all the time, did you know that that book is a book full of stories? Here's a quote. It's significant that God does not present us with salvation in the form of an abstract truth or a precise definition or even a catchy slogan, but as a story. Story is an invitation to participate with our imagination, and then, if we will, by faith, with our total lives in response to God. God tells a story. So sometimes you'll hear the thing like, the Bible's just a book of rules. Well, maybe there's some rules in it, but even when you pay attention to those rules are set within a narrative, within a story. The whole thing is set up like a story because humans learn by connecting to stories, okay? So, fun fact number 3, did you know that stories shape the world? And the stories we tell shape the world our kids inherit. So if we're telling stories about how there's not enough and we should always be afraid and the world is going to end, that's going to shape the world in a certain way. And that's going to shape the world that our kids inherit, isn't it? If we tell stories, I'm going to not keep going on that train of thought, but the stories we tell each other shape the world we live in. They shape how we understand reality. Here's the quote. After we tell God's story, it tells us, and then we have a new story to tell. The stories shape the community, and the community responds with new stories, but the telling and the hearing have the power to transform. So if we're telling stories about love, the world we create around us will be more loving. If we're telling stories about how it's us against them, and man, you better just fight for your rights or fight for whatever, the world is going to look like that. The stories we tell shape the world we live in. All right. This morning, we're going to lean into what it means that we are storytelling creatures who need to hear good stories. And we're going to lean into the fact that God is going to use your story in here, not my story, not just anyone else's story, not the famous people's story. He's actually going to use your story, what you have lived through, to shape the world in his love. Okay? He's going to use your story to heal and call others, whether you're 9 years old or you're 98 years old. Okay, so I'm going to tell a Bible story. And as you are on your table, so kids are welcome to keep doing their crafts on the tables. They are welcome to keep doing the weaving as it's making itself around. And I'm just going to tell a story. So you can close your eyes and enter the story, or you can pay attention, anything like that. But I'm going to tell a story about Esther. Esther is a time when telling a good story saved lives. So there's 4 characters in the story of Esther in the Bible. There's Esther, whose name firstly was Hadassah, but she changed her name to Esther. That's in the story. There's her uncle or cousin Mordecai. It kind of depends on which translation you use. A relative named Mordecai. There's the king Xerxes. He's the king of Persia. And then there's Xerxes' right-hand man, Haman, who is an advisor to the king. Those are the 4 main characters. And here we go. The story of Esther. Can you see me if I'm down here? Yeah, okay. The story of Esther in the Old Testament is a powerful one. It's one of my favorites when I was a child. And curiously, God is never mentioned once in this story. God isn't even named. You don't even know God's in the story. And yet, when we read it, we know God is present. We see God's hand moving in the details of this story because God is present in all our stories, in all our lives. So Esther starts out with a greedy king. How many stories have we heard about a greedy king? Greedy kings never happen these days, do they? They do. Esther starts out with a greedy king, Xerxes of Persia, and he used his wife, Queen Vashti, to entertain the men who propped him up, the men who gave him power. He said, Vashti, come dance for these men. And she said, no, I'm not going to do that. And he promptly shipped her out and got rid of her. Off she was because she refused to entertain the men. I could just leave it there, but I'm going to keep going. So then King Xerxes sets out to find a new queen. And this is where we are introduced to a young girl named Hadassah, later renamed to Esther. She was an orphaned Jewish girl living with her relative Mordecai in the Persian Empire under King Xerxes. Now, Hadassah, this young Jewish girl, she had lived in a story. First of all, she knew her people's story. She knew they were Jews, although this was kept very quiet. But she knew those stories of her family who followed Yahweh. She knew the stories of the fathers Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob. She knew of how her people had been enslaved in Egypt and then delivered on dry land through the sea. She knew of Moses and the law and the ways God provided in the desert for her people. She knew God was with her people. She knew God had called her people. And she knew there was a covenant made with her people. And she knew this because people had told her the stories. She had sat around a fire and people had told her these stories. And she knew her own story. She knew the story of her family, her mom and dad who had been killed, and her relatives who were all gone now. She knew how she had been hurt. She knew that she was sad. She knew what had happened to herself. She had gone to live with her relative, and together, her and Mordecai formed a family that kept these snuffed out stories alive. Now, when King Xerxes was looking for his new wife, Hadassah, who changed her name to Esther, was led to try to win that place in his heart. And here's where her story takes an interesting turn, because win it she did. She found favor with the king and was chosen as her new queen. Now, the king had an advisor named Haman, who was as greedy for influence and power as any man could be. That never happens these days, does it? That's a joke. It does happen these days. And Haman one day was sitting at the palace gates, and Mordecai came walking by. And Haman, in his great power, said, "Every person who passes by should bow to me." And Mordecai said, "Nope." Like Queen Vashti, "Nope, I'm not going to do that." And because Mordecai knows that this man is not someone to be bowed to. But Haman was so enraged, he ordered Mordecai killed. And eventually, that wasn't even enough. Haman was so enraged that he tricked the king into issuing a royal decree that all the Jews in all his land should be killed. The ultimate payback to Mordecai the Jew for not bowing to Haman's power. So here we have Queen Esther, who knows that in her story, her true name is Hadassah, and she is the daughter of the Jewish people, and she knows she is condemned to death by this tricky decree of Haman's need for power. And it's here that she realizes that she and her story have been led to this place at this time for this reason, to live her story out and to tell her story. So in this supreme act of courage, after fasting and praying and rallying the Jewish people, she goes to the king, and she invites the king and Haman to her quarters for a meal. She feeds them, and maybe she entertains them with a story, one from her childhood, and it goes really well. They really liked going to her house or her quarters for a meal. So she invites them again the next night. She does it again, and this time she reveals the truth to the king and Haman. She tells the truth of who she is, the stories that made her her. She tells her history, her family's history, and the story of Yahweh and the world. And she says, "You, my king, and you, Haman, you've condemned me, a Jew, to death out of this selfish, greedy act of pride." And the king is furious. He is furious at Haman for this trick. And Haman begs for his life. But the king sees him now for what he really is. And he condemns him to death. And this is a bit grisly, but he has him killed by the same means he wanted to kill Mordecai with. The king then enabled the Jews to fight and organize and protect themselves, and they survived. They were not wiped out, and it was Esther's story told at the very right moment, told confidently, telling where God was in it, who she was named to be, a daughter of Israel, that had made the difference. So in this story, Hadassah's story, the story she knew her people, knew her faith, this is God's presence in the world, and telling the story made the difference. And I love this story for us, right? Because we all have lives, and we all have families, and we all have traditions that have made us us. And we all have traditions where we have seen God at work in our lives. We have all experiences where we've seen that. And maybe our stories, like Esther's, will shift the stories for others. Notice I'm not saying our opinions are going to shape the story for others. That never happens. But sometimes sharing your story, not arguing, sharing your story is what shifts things in another person's story. So if we have a story of peace in our own lives, maybe that will help someone else live peacefully in their lives. Maybe if we have a story of love in our lives, maybe that will help someone else live out of love in their lives. What if you have a story of provision during hardship? Maybe that will help someone else live trusting in the hardship. Or what if you have a story of failure, and yet you were resilient and you got back up after that failure? Man, we need to hear those stories more. That story might shape things for someone else. So the real details of your lives are important. So you've written down your stories, and you've answered those questions. I want you to look at your piece of paper right now. Every single one of those words or little pictures represents a story in your life. And if you are wanting to, you could flip that over and write important on it, because all those stories represent something you have learned, you have gone through, a place where God has been present to you, and those are important stories for our world to know. So you could take this home, you could stick it in a book, you could stick it in your bedside table, and when you open it, you could be reminded that, oh, my story is important. What I've lived through actually might be important for someone's life. And we can pray that your story is used at the right time. Maybe don't go telling everybody your story all the time, at every moment. But at the right time, your story will be used to help lead someone else home and maybe help lead yourself home. So that's what that activity is about. And even the kids, your stories are important too. So I wanted to just open it up to one person who would love to come to the front and answer one of those questions. I'm going to ask that it maybe be the question about who is a mentor or teacher in your life. Is anyone willing to come to the front and tell that story? No? Anyone? Oh, I could pick someone. No one is looking at me all of a sudden. Any of the other questions? I want to just hear one story from someone in the group about something in... Avery, come up. Yeah. Come on. I like this. Okay, what do you want to answer?
Maybe one of my teachers.
Okay, you want to tell us about that? Who's someone who's important in your life?
A teacher when I was in grade 2.
Aw, how come?
Because I had trouble with reading, and she helped me
Aw,
with that.
what did she do?
So she gave me extra work for that.
Extra work is good. Well, that's so good. And how did it make you feel?
It made me feel better. Then now I know better how to read better.
Yeah, that's amazing. Oh, thank you so much for sharing. Even just that, her story tells us, one, we're not alone. Someone is coming, someone can help us. There are people who know, and we can ask for help. Hello, do we need to hear that every single day? Yes. So thank you so much for sharing your story, and I love that you were encouraged by your teacher. She's now my favorite teacher, too. Great, thank you. Okay, round of applause for Avery. I love that. Okay.